Alright guys, this is part 2 of the installation for the Toyota Tacoma lift kit. Let's get this started.
Now you move to the front of the truck and remove the skid plate by undoing the four 12mm bolts. You should then be able to access the skid plate mounting brackets, and those are held on there by 17mm bolts, and there's 4 on the driver's side and 3 on the passenger side. Okay, so now you should be able to install the differential drop, and to do that you have to undo these two 22mm bolts that hold that differential to the frame. I actually undid one at a time. I only loosened the driver's side one, and then I completely undid the passenger side one so that I can install the new spacer as well as the new mounting bolts. So the new mounting bolts will actually have a smaller head. These are 22 mils while the new ones are 19, but the actual width or the diameter of the bolt is actually still the same. It's just smaller mounting heads. So the new hardware will have to be installed along with the new spacer, and those are torqued down to 100 foot-pounds. Now to put those skid plate brackets back, you'll have to actually do a quick modification on the driver's side bracket. So to the rear of it, you'll have to take a tape measure and measure 4 inches from the back and then 1 inch from the bottom. You'll have to cut like a small square from it because the new differential drop is actually going to interfere with this bracket. So by modifying it, it should fit. I'm using an angle grinder to remove that material and then finishing it off with sanding flaps. Make sure you also paint over that bare metal so it doesn't corrode and get destroyed in the future. Now you should be able to remount those skid plate brackets. Now again, those are 17mm and those are tightened down to 35 foot-pounds. You should then be able to reinstall that front skid plate. Again, 12mm, and there's 4 of them. And those are just hand tightened as well. That pretty much finishes up the front side of the installation for this lift kit. You should be able to put your wheels back and make sure you tighten them down in a star pattern and torque them down to 85 foot-pounds. So next thing you do is jack up the rear of the truck and make sure you put the jack stands right under the frame. You'd want to jack up the truck fairly high so that the clearance between the tires and the actual ground is roughly 6 inches, and you'll see why in a little bit. Next, you'll want to jack up the axle and make sure you rest that axle on jack stands as well. So you'll need a whole bunch of jack stands for this part of the truck. You can then remove the wheels so that now you have access to both wheel wells. Now remove the 17mm nut and bolt that secure the lower portion of the shock. So the upper mounting nut for that rear strut was so seized up that I pretty much just took an angle grinder to cut off that nut so that that whole thing comes off. This is size 14, so if you guys can take that off, you can do that, or you could just do the easy way like what I did, use an angle grinder to cut that whole thing off. Comes off pretty easily. Okay, now let's move on to the rear axle brackets and the U-bolts. Those U-bolts are held on by a 19mm nut, and just undo all 4 of them on both sides, and that should free up the axle from the leaf springs. You should then be able to take that axle, jack it up, and lower the actual jack stands below it so you can put the spacers in between the leaf springs and the axle. Just be careful not to overstretch the hydraulic lines that go from the axle onto the frame. Just a quick note, I did place a jack stand right underneath the drive shaft so that the axle doesn't rotate forward. Now if you jacked up your truck high enough, you wouldn't have to do this, but for me I didn't, so I used the jack to pretty much compress the leaf springs so I could put the spacers in between the axle and the sleeve springs. You should then be able to mount the axle bracket onto the new U-bolts provided in the kit. Next, you can mount the lower portion of the new shock onto the axle. Just take note that I did keep the wire that held that shock compressed in place, and you'll see why in a bit. Next, you'd want to put in the proper hardware for that shock, and then finally cut that cable so that it expands into where it's supposed to be mounted. You should then be able to put the final portions of the hardware of that shock and secure that with the provided 14mm nut. And that nut is torqued down to 15 foot-pounds or hand tight, whatever you prefer. Finally, you can torque down all the bolts and nuts in the assembly, starting with the lower mounting nut and bolt on the shock. So that's torqued down to 61 foot-pounds. And on the bracket that holds the axle onto the leaf springs, those are all torqued down to 118 foot-pounds. Now you can put the wheels back, put those lugs back on, and those should be torqued down to 85 foot-pounds.
Alright guys, that's pretty much it for the installation of this lift kit. So I just have 2 tips to leave with you. Since you're removing the wheels and have pretty good access to the wheel wells, this will probably be a good time to remove all the rust and apply some anti-rust coating. I like to use POR 15 because that stuff is really good at converting rust into a nice coat to prevent further corrosion from happening. I'm going to leave a description of what POR 15 is down below, and you'll see as the actual videos progress, all my wheel wells have been painted black. And that's why it took a little bit longer to do this installation. So the biggest pain with this installation was actually mounting the axle spacers, because those have to be properly aligned. So you'll have to shift the axle back and forth as well as rotate it so that you can get those spacers to line up and mount properly. And finally, I did launch my online store, so hopefully you guys check that out. The store's link will be in the description below. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, because I'm gonna keep putting out new videos every week that you guys can hopefully learn from. So till next time guys, peace out.